inflation has moderated somewhat since the middle of last year. Nonetheless, inflation pressures continue to run high, and the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go. The median projection in the S&P for total PCE inflation is 3.2% this year, 2.5% next year, and 2.1% in 2025. Core PCE inflation, which excludes volatile and food and energy prices, is projected to run higher than total inflation, and the median projection has been revised in the S&P up to 3.9% this year. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. As I noted earlier, since early last year, we have raised our policy rate by 5 percentage points. We have been seeing the effects of our policy tightening on demand in the most interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy, especially housing and investment. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. The economy is facing headwinds from tighter credit conditions for households and businesses, which are likely to weigh on economic activity, hiring, and inflation. The extent of these effects remains uncertain. In light of how far we've come in tightening policy, the uncertain lags with which monetary policy affects the economy, and potential headwinds from credit tightening, the committee decided at today's meeting to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 5 to 5.25%, and to continue the process of significantly reducing our securities holdings. As I noted earlier, nearly all committee participants expect that it will be appropriate to raise interest rates somewhat further by the end of the year. But at this meeting, considering how fast we've moved, we judged it prudent to hold the target range steady to allow the committee to assess additional information and its implications for monetary policy. In determining the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate to return inflation to 2% over time, the committee will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy, the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, and economic and financial developments. In our SEP, participants wrote down their individual assessments of an appropriate path for the federal funds rate based on what each participant judges to be the most likely scenario going forward. If the economy evolves as projected, the median participant projects that the appropriate level of the federal funds rate will be 5.6% at the end of this year, 4.6% at the end of 2024, and 3.4% at the end of 2025. For the end of this year, the median projection is a 0.5 percentage point higher than in our March projections. I hasten to add, as always, that these projections are not a committee decision or plan. If the economy does not evolve as projected, path for policy will adjust as appropriate to foster our maximum employment and price stability goals. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting based on the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation, as well as the balance of risks. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do at the Fed is in service to our public mission. We will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Colby Smith with the Financial Times. I'm curious what gives you and the committee the confidence that waiting will not be counterproductive at a time when the monthly pace of core inflation is still so elevated. Interest rate sensitive sectors like housing, while they've felt the drag of the past Fed actions, have started to recover in some regions, and financial conditions, most recently were easing.
So I guess I would go back to the beginning of this tightening cycle to address that. So as we started our rate hikes early last year, we said there were three issues that would need to be addressed kind of in sequence. And that at the speed of tightening, the level to which rates would need to go, and then the period of time over which we need to keep policy restricted. So at the outset, going back 15 months, the key issue was how fast to move rates up, and we moved very quickly by historical standards. Then last December, after 4 consecutive 75 basis point hikes, we moderated to a pace of a 50 basis point hike, and then this year to 3 25 basis point hikes at sequential meetings. So it seemed to us to make obvious sense to moderate our rate hikes as we got closer to our destination. So the decision to consider not hiking at every meeting and ultimately to hold rates steady at this meeting, I would just say it's a continuation of that process. The main issue that we're focused on now is determining the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate to return inflation to 2% over time. So the pace of the increases and the ultimate level of increases are separate variables. Given how far we have come, it may make sense for rates to move higher, but at a more moderate pace. I want to stress one more thing, and that is that the committee decision made today was only about this meeting. We didn't make any decision about going forward, including what would happen at the next meeting, including we did not decide or really discuss anything about going to an every other meeting kind of an approach or really any other approach. We really were focused on what to do at this meeting.
So there was no kind of initial debate about the possibility of July, any sense of the initial support at this stage for that move?
So again, we didn't make a decision about July. I mean, of course, it came up in the meeting from time to time, but really the focus was on what to do today. I would say about July, two things. One, decision hasn't been made. Two, I do expect that it will be a live.
Thanks, Howard Schneider with Reuters. I was just wondering if you could help us understand the narrative here, because it feels like there's been a level shift in the dots, stronger GDP, less of a hit to unemployment, slower progress on inflation. And I'm wondering, in this sort of, where's the disinflation coming from?
Sure.
The labor market's going to be stronger, it looks like. It's not coming from there. Demand is not coming down all that fast, according to GDP. You've doubled your estimate of GDP. So what's the narrative here? It seems like it's getting more immaculate rather than more messy.
So you're right that the data came in, I would say, consistent with, but on the high side of expectations. So, and if you go back to the former SEP, the last SEP in March, you will see that growth moved up. These are not huge moves, but growth estimates moved up a bit. Unemployment estimates moved down a bit. Inflation estimates moved up a bit. And, all three of those kind of point in the same direction, which is, that perhaps more restraint will be necessary, consistent if you think about it, where the federal funds rate was trading before the bank incidents of early March. So we've kind of gone back to that. So your question is, where's the disinflation going to come from? And, I don't think the story has really changed. The committee has consistently said and believed that the process of getting inflation down is going to be a gradual one. It's going to take some time. And I think you go back to the three-part framework for core PCE inflation, which is, we think, as good an indicator as you can have for where inflation is going forward. You start with goods. With goods, we need to see continued healing in supply side conditions. They've definitely improved a substantial amount, but if you talk to people in business, they will say it's not back to where it was. So that's one thing, and that should enable goods prices to continue, goods inflation to continue to come down over time. In terms of housing services inflation, that's another big piece, and you are seeing there that new rents, new leases are coming in at low levels, and it's really a matter of time as that goes through the pipeline. In fact, I think any forecast that people are making right now about inflation coming down this year will contain a big dose of this year and next year will contain a good amount of disinflation from that source. And that's, again, probably going to come slower than we would expect. That leaves the big sector, which is a little more than half, pardon me, of the core piece of inflation. That's non-housing services. And, we see only the earliest signs of disinflation there. It's a sector, it's a very broad and diverse sector. I would say in a number of the parts of that sector, the largest cost would be wage costs. It's the service sector, so it's heavily labor intensive. And I think many analysts would say that the key to getting inflation down there is to have a continuing loosening in labor market conditions, which we have seen. We have actually seen, go through a number of indicators suggesting there's been some loosening in labor market conditions. We need to see that continue. I would almost say that the conditions that we need to see in place to get inflation down are coming into place, and that would be growth meaningfully below trend. It would be a labor market that's loosening. It would be goods pipelines getting healthier and healthier, and that kind of thing. The things are in place that we need to see, but the process of that actually working on inflation is going to take some time.
Nick Timrose, the Wall Street Journal. Chirko, what's the value in pausing and signaling future hikes versus just hiking now? I mean, not to be flippant, but I don't lose weight just by buying a gym membership. I have to actually go to the gym. 16 of your colleagues put down a higher year-end 23 rate today. The majority of you think you're going to have to go up by 50 basis points this year. So why not just rip off the Band-Aid and raise rates today?
So first, I would say that the question of speed is a separate question from the question from that of level. Okay, so and I think if you look at the SEP, that is our estimate. Our individual, it's really accumulation of our individual estimates of how far to go. I mentioned how we got to those numbers. In terms of speed, it's what I said at the beginning, which is speed was very important last year. As we get closer and closer to the destination, and according to the SEP, we're not so far away from the destination in most people's accounting. It's reasonable, it's common sense to go a little slower, just as it was reasonable to go from 75 basis points to 50 to 25 at every meeting. And so the committee thought overall that it was appropriate to moderate the pace, if only slightly. And there are benefits to that. So that gives us more information to make decisions. We may try to make better decisions. I think it allows the economy a little more time to adapt as we make our decisions going forward, and we'll get to see. We don't know the full extent of the consequences of the banking turmoil that we've seen. It would be early to see those, but we don't know what the extent is. We'll have some more time to see that unfold. And it's just the idea that we're trying to get this right, and this is if you think of the two things as separate variables, then I think that the skip, I shouldn't call it a skip, the decision. Makes sense.
I know you said July is live with only one June employment, with only the June employment and the CPI report for June due to be released before the July meeting. You get the ECI after, you get the senior loan officer survey after, you get some bank earnings at the end of next month. What incremental information will the committee be using to inform their judgment on whether this is in fact a skip or a longer pause?
Well, I think you're adding that to the data that we've seen since the last meeting too. Since we chose to maintain rates at this meeting, it'll really be a 3-month period of data that we can look at. I think that's a full quarter, and I think you can draw more conclusions from that than you can from any 6-week period. We'll look at those things. We'll also look at the evolving risk picture. We'll look at what's happening in the financial sector. We'll look at all the data, the evolving outlook, and we'll make a decision.
Thanks for taking our questions. Gina Smiley, New York Times. You obviously in your forecasts marked up the sort of path for growth, marked down the path for unemployment, marked up the path for inflation pretty notably. I wonder, since March, what has changed to make you think that the economy is a lot more resilient and inflation is going to be a lot more stubborn? And given that, why do you feel confident this is as high as you're going to have to revise the federal funds rate? Or do you think it's possible we could have even a higher than 5.6% terminal by the end of this cycle?
I mean, on the first part, I just think we're following the data and also the outlook. The economy the labor market, I think, has surprised many, if not all, analysts over the last couple of years with its extraordinary resilience, really. It's just remarkable, and that's really, if you think about it, that's what's driving it's job creation, it's wages moving up, it's supporting spending, which in turn is supporting hiring, and it's really the engine, it seems, that is driving the economy. And so it's really the data. In terms of we always write down at these meetings what we think the appropriate terminal rate will be at the end of this year. That's how we do it. It's based on our own individual assessments of what the most likely path of the economy is. It can actually in reality wind up being lower or higher. And there's really no way to know, but it's what people think as of today. And as the data come in, it can move around during the intermeeting period. It could wind up back in the same place, but it really will be data driven. I can't tell you that I ever have a lot of confidence that we can see where the federal funds rate will be that far in advance.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for my question. You had said back at the end of May that you thought risks were getting closer to being into balance. Is that still the case, or has your mind changed about the balance of risks out there? And also, could you give us an idea of what would be a sufficiently restrictive funds rate? Obviously the current rate, according to the committee, is not sufficiently restrictive. Is it 5.6? Is it 6 words or sufficiently restrictive? Thank you.
I would say again that I think that over time, the balance of risks, as we've moved from from interest rates at effectively 0 now to 5 percentage points with an SEP calling for additional hikes, I think we've moved much closer to our destination, which is that sufficiently restrictive rate. And I think that means, almost by definition, that the risks of sort of overdoing it and underdoing it are getting closer to being in balance. I still think, and my colleagues agree, that the risks to inflation are to the upside still. So we don't think we're there with inflation yet, because we're just looking at the data. And if you look at the full range of inflation data, particularly the core data, you just aren't seeing a lot of progress over the last year. Headline, of course, inflation has come down materially, but as you know, we look at core as a better indicator of where inflation overall is going. Sufficiently, so I think what we'd like to see is credible evidence that inflation is topping out and then beginning to come down. That's what we want to see. Of course, that's what we want to see. And I think it's also, we understand that there are lags, but remember that it's more than a year since financial conditions began tightening. I think the reason we're comfortable pausing is that we are still, much of the tightening took place over last summer and later into the year. And I think it's reasonable to think that some of that may come into effect. So we're, I think stretching out into a more moderate pace is appropriate to allow you to make that judgment of sufficiency, more with more data over time.
Hi, Chair Powell, Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thanks for taking our questions. I wanted to ask further on the lag effects. When you're considering when you would hike again throughout the course of the year, are there things that you would expect to kick in as those lag effects come into effect that would inform your decisions? Have you learned things over the past year that give you some sense of timeline for when to expect those lags to come into effect?
Yeah. So it's a challenging thing with economics. It's sort of standard thinking that monetary policy affects economic activity with long and variable lags. Of course, these days, financial conditions begin to tighten well in advance of actual rate hikes. So if you look back when we were lifting off, we started talking about lifting off. By the time we had lifted off the 2-year, which is a pretty good estimate of where policy is going, they're going from 20 basis points to 200 basis points. So in that sense, tightening happens much sooner than it used to, where news was in newspapers and not on the wire. So that's different. What you see is interest sensitive spending is affected very, very quickly. So